Katie from the Faulkner County Library, and we are here today with a DIY craft. We are going to be making mosaic trays. And these are going to resemble a little bit stained glass, but instead of using glass, we're going to use paper. So let's go ahead and gather up your supplies that you will need. From your supply box, you're going to want your glue, and it helps me to use a paintbrush. You don't have to use a paintbrush, but I will be using a paintbrush. And then from your activity kit, you should have a tray, some glass beads, and then several different colors of tissue paper. Once you have all of your supplies ready to go, let's begin making the mosaic tray. So this is a project that we are going to work on in steps. I just want you to know before we get started that there is going to be a little bit of downtime while you're working, that you're going to be needing to wait for the glue to dry, because it might be a little bit frustrating to have to wait for the project while you're working on it, but it will make the end result much better, and you will be a lot happier with your tray if you wait throughout the project. So what we're going to do, and I forgot to mention that you might also want your scissors. So what we're going to do is either tear or cut pieces of the paper to use as our mosaic. If you cut strips or tear strips, you're going to get a more uniform look. But if you do smaller pieces, then you're going to get kind of a scrappier look. So it's just depending on what look you would like to go for on your tray. So once you get your paper in strips or small pieces, you are going to glue it down. And the way I'm going to glue it down is by painting on the glue. You can either, one trick would be just to open up the glue bottle and very carefully dipping your paintbrush into the glue and then painting it onto your tray, which we can then put the paper onto. If you're a little bit worried that you might knock over the glue, or if that feels a little bit risky, then another option would be to either put the glue on a small paper plate or a small bowl or a small container, and then you can just dip the glue out of that. So that, I think, is how I'm going to work. So I'm going to close my glue back up and just work out of a small container. And you're just going to glue your strips. It's okay if it's over the edge a little bit. I'll go back in just a little while and cut off some of the extra. So I am going to do strips on the back of my tray. I want to make sure the entire tray is covered up with color. You can do whatever you would like. You might be happier with the end result if you get as much paper on your tray as possible. And a couple of things that you're going to want to remember about working with tissue paper. Number one, it is kind of fragile. So especially when it gets wet with the glue. So try not to use too much glue, because number one, that's going to take longer to dry, and number two, it might make the tissue even more fragile. Also, as you're rubbing, and right here I noticed, the tissue paper possibly could rip while you're working on it. It's just, that's the way it is. So if you do find that you have a hole because of the tissue paper, you can either I just folded up the extra on the edge and use that, or you could also just tear off a smaller piece to cover that up. And when it dries, you won't really notice that you had to add some extra tissue paper to cover up any holes. So if you have any rips, just cover it up while you're still working on it, and it will be perfectly fine in the end. Also, you might notice that some of the tissue paper, especially the darker colors, the color tends to run when it gets wet. And if you have that, you can cover it up with other paper. It shouldn't be an issue, but just know that that could possibly happen. So I'm now adding a blue stripe. And remember that this is your art project. It does not have to look like how mine is. I'm just kind of doing a random assortment of colors. You can look into doing a pattern if you would like, or a specific design. Also, when we start working on the front, we can talk a little more about how you can choose to have one design over the entire tray, or you can do something a little bit different on both sides. So yeah, I'm noticing that it's tending to rip right there on the edge. And so I'll just cover it back up with a little bit more tissue paper and it will be good to go. You also want to try and keep your hand, my hands have some glue on them, which is grabbing some of the tissue paper. So as soon as I get this in place, I'm gonna take a quick break just to wipe my hands and make sure that they're not gonna harm my design in any way. I'm gonna trim off this extra piece. And now I'm back adding some green. I think that as much as I can with this, I'm gonna try and go with just an pattern. So I've used all of my colors, so I'm gonna go back to starting to use the red now. And if you notice while you're working that any edges are not quite glued down, you can just kind of go over the edge. We're actually, in just a little while, we're gonna talk about the sealing process. So if you have a little bit of some places that look like they're shiny or have extra glue, that is actually a look we're gonna go for in the end. So it's no big deal if you go ahead and get started with that process a little bit early. And I'm not gonna have enough room based on the size of my stripes to use every color. So I'm just gonna go ahead and finish it out using the pinky purple that was in my kit. I'll just carry that on down to the edge. Okay, so I am gonna let this dry for just a minute just to make sure that it's gonna be safe for me to turn it over and go ahead and be working on the front. Once you have the back of your tray ready, it's dried a little bit, we're gonna go ahead and flip it over and start working on the front side. And while this was drying, I went ahead and cut off some of the extra paper so that I have more of a clean surface to work with. So for this front side, I think I'm gonna go with the more mosaic look. So I've torn my paper into smaller pieces and I'm just gonna kind of randomly apply them to the tray. So I'm just gonna add some glue here and there and then just glue down my papers. And I'm not really going in any kind of color order, or I don't really have any pre-planned design ideas. I'm just gonna watch what happens. And so having both sides of the tray really gives you an opportunity to try new things. Or if you really like what you were doing on one side and you decide, oh, I want to make sure and continue that on the other side, you can do that also. And I just tore these pieces so they're not in any kind of uniform shapes. That's something you could do. And I have used several rectangles and squares in my project, but don't forget that you can try and cut your paper into any shape you want. If you wanted to use circles or if you wanted to use hearts or stars, that might be something really neat. Really, this project lets you kind of have some control into what you want to do. And I tore the red a little bit there, so I'm just adding a piece to cover it up, and it will not be noticeable. So I'm just putting glue in small areas and then adding the paper as I see where it might fit. I am touching the glue a lot more on this side than I was on the back, so I'm taking pretty frequent breaks just to make sure I don't have glue on my hand so that I don't rub the paper and tear it. But otherwise, pretty much using the same techniques as I used on the other side of the tray. And again, if you have any overlap, that's perfectly fine. You can either just fold it over or you can cut it off after it dries a little bit. I think that if you were going to use smaller pieces, that it helps if you cut out or tear out a number of pieces before you get started working, just so that you can make sure that you have them and that you're not worrying about if you're going to get glue on the rest of the paper or if your hands are going to get stuck while you're cutting. You can always cut out more pieces if you need them, but it's helpful to have some ready to go so you can just be working and placing without having to really worry about any kind of extra mess. And don't forget, we are going to seal these as the final step. So if you get glue over some of the paper that you've already got on the tray, that is perfectly fine. We're actually going to intentionally cover it back up later. So that is not going to be a big deal. The only thing that does is makes it a little bit messier if you touch the glue and then you touch the paper, your hands are a little bit stickier. It probably would help also with the mess. If you can see, I'm starting at the top of my tray and working my way down. That way that I'm not continuously having to touch any glue or any paper here at the bottom. So if you pick a spot to start with and then you work outward from there, you're probably going to be better off in the long run. And if you have any wrinkles or anything in your paper, that's fine. You can use your brush to just try and get some of the wrinkles out. But again, make sure you're being careful not to rub too hard. There's a little bit of a balance. If you get any of your paper that wants to fly onto your page, you can either just take that as a sign that that was meant to be in that spot, or you can try and gently remove it and then place it where you would like. And remember, there is no right or wrong way to do this. If you are not happy with how something is turning out, you can cover it up, or you can add pieces around it. You can try to remove the pieces. I will say that once the piece has enough glue on it, once the piece is on your tray and is glued down, you probably are not going to be able to salvage it if you did want to remove it and then try to use it later. So just do be aware. The only thing that you need to be aware of is the limitation in your supplies, because you might not be able to replace if you were to take a piece off of the tray and try and use it again. I'm not sure how many uses each paper is going to have once it's got the glue on it. So once it's on the tray, it's not necessarily stuck there permanently. You can make some minor changes, but just be aware of your supplies and the limitations that you might have in replacing bigger areas. I'm finding it easier with the smaller pieces to kind of use my paint. Instead of using my finger, I feel like I use my fingers a lot more with the stripes and putting them down. But with the smaller pieces, I'm finding it easier to use my paintbrush and just gently painting them over them to get them to stick in place. And I'm just going to turn my tray a little bit so I can work on this side without any kind of interrupting of that side. And I'm starting to see a little bit where my paintbrush has gotten glue on the red paper and it's run through a little bit. And so I'm getting some red stripes, and that's not really a big deal. I am going to be careful when I'm painting over some of the lighter pieces. If I see any red, I'll make sure and stop, because I don't really want any color over my paper, but it's fine if it's under them. I'm going to get some more bigger strips of the paint. And see, here's an example. I wasn't super careful when I put my glue down, and so I have some glue on this pink paper, and it's made it a little bit harder to work with than it otherwise would be. So just be aware of where the glue is and where the paper is, so that you're not getting glue on your paper unintentionally. I am running out of green, so I'm going to add some more of it. You're going to want to be careful as we near the end and have less workspace. Be careful of where you rest your fingers or your hands. You do not want to get stuck to your tray. So just be mindful of the space that you have available and where the glue is. Okay, so I have all of the major areas of my tray covered up now. So I'm just going to look through and see where the holes are. I'm going to make sure my hands are really clean and don't have any glue, because I'm going to be cutting or tearing my strips of paper into even smaller pieces to fill in some of these gaps. So I see a line right here that I'm going to put this pink. And then I've got some places on the bottom. And if you can see, I'm working on this baggie that the kit came in, just to make sure that any glue that wasn't 100% dry on the bottom, just to make sure that it doesn't stick to my surface. It's mostly dry, but there are a few places I can tell when I move the tray that they're not quite dry. And so I'm just trying to prevent any kind of sticking to the workspace. In some of these little areas, especially on the edge, you're just going to have to be really careful of how you place the paper and how you make sure that you don't have glue on your hands, because they are very tiny and seem to want to stick. So this might be a good place where you can just kind of place them down and then use the paintbrush to gently keep them in. So I have a little paper towel handy that I've been using throughout the process. So you might want to have a little paper towel just to make sure that your hands are as glue-free as possible. And if you have some areas that don't have paper covering them and you don't want to cover it back up, that's perfectly fine. You can have some empty patches. This piece, I'm just placing it with the paintbrush even. I'm worried to even touch my finger because it was so small and the area has a lot of glue on it. I'm going to put this pink right here, and I know this is too big, but I'll just trim it off the edge. And I think I am happy with how my pieces of mosaic are placed, or how my pieces of paper are placed to give me the mosaic look. And so now we're going to go ahead and talk about the final step that you're going to do. So this is an example of this mosaic tray activity finished. So you can see it's looks similar to what we have done. And I don't know if it's coming through the camera or not, but if you look at this in person, it is very shiny. So our next step is going to help us make sure that we get that shiny appearance on our own tray. So what you're going to do, and I'm going to go ahead and do it to this top layer and then let it give some time to dry. So you're going to take your glue and you're just going to paint a layer of glue all over the entire tray. So we're not worried this time about placing pieces or putting anything anywhere. We just want to have a layer of glue over everything. And this is going to seal our paper, and it's also going to give us the shiny appearance. And I know earlier I said not to use too much glue because then you were going to have to worry about it getting dry. Really here, I mean, you don't want it to just be pooling up in the middle, but you want to use a good amount of glue here to make sure that you get every little inch of the tray covered up so that you'll have a shiny and protected tray to use. And I would suggest going ahead and doing this on the top layer now so that you can let it dry. And then when it's dry, you can turn your tray over and you can do the exact same thing on the bottom. And once I get the sealing layer applied, I'm going to talk to you about the mosaic beads because you're probably going to want to use them on this top side of the tray too. So we'll go ahead and work on those while this is waiting to dry. And be careful that you don't rip any of your paper during this process. Again, if you do, just put a little piece of paper to cover it up. But for the most part, you're just wanting to do a quick and easy layer of glue carefully as kind of a finishing touch for your artwork. Okay, so I am happy with, I think I got most of the areas, if not all of the areas. The goal is to get all the areas. It's a little hard to see kind of in the middle. But once you have the entire top of your tray coated in glue for the sealing process, we're going to go ahead and place our beads. And you can place your beads however you would like. I am going to place mine on the outer edge though. And you can also here, you can look through your bead colors and see if there is a particular pattern that you would like to do, or if you have enough of one color that you would like to do all one color, you can do that. I am just gonna stick with my random approach and just start placing beads as I grab them on the outside of the tray. And the beads do not need to be sealed. So the glue that's there for the sealing should hold them on, but you do not need to go over them with any more glue. And I'm putting my beads on the edge of the tray. I have seen where you could also put them on the inside of the tray. Just think about what you might use the tray for before you do that, because you want to make sure that they don't get bumped off or that they don't block you from being able to use the tray however you intended to use it. And once you have your beads in place, we are going to let that just sit and dry for a little while. Once you let the top layer dry, you're going to flip over your tray and you're going to do the exact same thing on the bottom. You're just going to paint the layer of glue over, let that dry, and then your finished product is going to be a shiny mosaic tray that you made yourself. Thank you so much for joining me for this DIY crafting. I hope you had fun working on your tray and that you enjoy having something that you made that you get to use now. Follow the Faulkner County Library Youth Services Facebook page or the Faulkner County Library YouTube channel for more information on programming. Thank you.